First report of the resurrection. Many children are led to believe in Santa Claus. At some point, they usually begin to question him. Some people just love the magic so much that they refuse to question. I can still remember as a child thinking about all that the myth involved. It had so many holes in it that if it had been a boat, it would have been sitting on the lake bottom in record time. Some people put the resurrection of Jesus in the same category. They view Christians who believe to be like those who choose to believe in Santa because they want to and don't want to look at the evidence for fear it will disprove their world. I want to write a series of posts looking at Jesus' resurrection. Christianity claims to be based on historical facts. It makes the claim that God actually acted in our space/time in ways that have been witnessed. It makes the claim that we can trust the testimony in the Bible. I have posted already about evidence that Jesus existed. Most of the evidence for the resurrection is in the form of reports and testimony. Most of the data comes from Christian sources. We should take that into account. A fair evaluation should take that into account. It does not mean that such sources cannot not be used. It comes down to trustworthy witnesses who had access to the information. I don't think we should be surprised that the people with the information became believers. What if the scenario looked like this? Jesus resurrected from the dead. The witness is in a position to know this. The person then rejected Jesus. The person then put out reports of the resurrection. Probably most people who had first-hand knowledge of the resurrection became Christians. What if the person did not actually see Jesus but knew the witnesses well enough to know that they were honest, sincere, and in a position to know? We don't have first-century reports from anyone skeptical, though there probably were those. The question is, were they in a position to know? In this post, we will look at the oldest written account of the resurrection, taken from one of the letters written by the Apostle Paul. Paul wrote 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. It is true that many critical scholars question that he wrote some of the books, but none doubt the book we will consider here. At least 6 are accepted as being Pauline by all scholars, including I Corinthians. Who was Paul? We learn about Paul from his own writings and from the book of Acts. See the post on Luke/Acts to learn more about who wrote it and when it was written. Here are some key points to keep in mind. Paul, was born Jew, but also a Roman citizen. Perhaps his father did something great to be awarded citizenship for. He was trained as a rabbi by the leading rabbi of his age, Gamaliel, who was from a famous family of rabbis. He was a vigorous persecutor of the early church. He was radically changed by an encounter with Jesus in what may have been a vision. He became a zealous missionary engaged in bringing the gospel, good news, of Jesus across the Roman Empire. He maintained his message through many imprisonments, beatings and stonings. He was executed for his faith during Nero's reign. Early tradition from multiple sources, Paul represents an instance of a skeptic and opponent of Christianity whose life was radically changed by an encounter with Jesus. Some skeptics charge that he was a fanatic who based everything on subjective visions. It is true that Paul never claimed to have seen Jesus in the flesh. This certainly does not prove that he did not value eyewitness testimony. Timeline for Paul. Key I Corinthians 15, 1-9 timeline for Creed. This is to say that we have all scholars agreeing that Paul records the resurrection in 55 AD, 25 years after the crucifixion. A wide-ranging group of scholars, believers and non-believers, consider this report to have been a creed that was given to Paul 2 to 8 years after the crucifixion. If he received it as an agreed-upon formulation of beliefs, that dictates that it originated earlier. Some make a case that it was developed within months of the resurrection. In any case, this is very early. Look at the points the creed makes. Christ died for our sins. He was buried. He was raised from the dead on the third day. In so doing, he fulfilled scriptural prophecies. He appeared to Cephas, Aramaic for Peter. He appeared to the 12, his disciples. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, available for confirmation. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Paul then added a word of personal testimony, that Jesus had appeared to him. Verse 8 states, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. 9 For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. This is a remarkable list of 6 separate appearances. Jesus' death by crucifixion is perhaps the best attested event, particularly to an individual, in all of ancient history. Paul records an impressive list of very early eyewitness testimony that must be accounted for in any explanation for the Easter claims. The list shows that the very first believers understood how important it was to be anchored in real history and that eyewitness testimony is critical. How early is early? In a world of emails and Instagram, we expect information to be available around the world in seconds. We are accustomed to recordings and demand instant access to information. That was not the way it was back in ancient times. We learn of people and events in history indirectly, and the records that we have were normally long after the events. With our modern expectations, it can be difficult to appreciate just how sharp the contrast is between the record of typical historical events, even world-changing ones, compared to the death and resurrection of Jesus. I put together an example. I will compare the record for the death of Julius Caesar to that of Jesus Christ. The events both took place around 2,000 years ago. Both were kings, though one's kingdom was not of this world. They even both have the same initials. We know that Julius Caesar lived. We have his coins and we have versions of his writings. He had a strong impact on the ancient world in ways that ultimately impact us today. William Shakespeare wrote the version of his death that is most remembered today, but it was written around 1600 AD. The famous line "Et tu, Brute" was invented by Shakespeare, as was the soothsayer saying, "Beware the Ides of March." Can we use archaeology? We do have coins with the face of Brutus, but it would be hard to prove independently when they were minted or why. It comes down to testimony. In the timelines below, I will compare our best information on Caesar's death to that of Jesus' death and resurrection. It is worth noting that from a purely historical vantage point, Caesar should have had the advantage. He was a leader of the most powerful nation in the Western world. Caesar only ruled Rome for 2 years. Yet in that 2 years, he was a tyrant. He was murdered, apparently on March 15, 44 BC. Certainly, the government changed at approximately that time. Wikipedia describes the event this way: Julius Caesar, the Roman dictator, was assassinated by a group of senators on the Ides of March, 15th of March, of 44 BC during a meeting of the Senate at the Theater of Pompey in Rome. The perpetrator stabbed Caesar 23 times. The act was undertaken ostensibly over fears that Caesar's unprecedented concentration of power during his dictatorship was undermining the Roman Republic. The conspirators, who styled themselves the Liberators, Latin, Liberators, presented the deed as an act of tyrannicide. Altogether at least 60 senators were party to the conspiracy. They were led by Marcus Brutus, Gaius Cassius, and Decimus Brutus Albinus. Jesus before Easter was unknown outside of Palestine. He had no government authority. He was killed as if he were a criminal just before a Jewish holiday. He was certainly at a disadvantage in what one might expect to be documented. Let's compare. Julius Caesar assassination. Julius Caesar assassination versus Jesus Christ resurrection. Event to the report, comparison. From there to here. It is good to be able to say that reports were written early. Unfortunately, we don't have the original documents. They weren't scanned either. We don't even have direct copies of the originals. Historians recognize the problem, yet describe history with various degrees of confidence based on the data they have. The next figures compare the copies on which our important texts are based. Caesar's assassination copied. Here we have the 3 books by which we know what happened to Julius Caesar. The key portion of Nicolaus of Damascus' book was copied into a book in the early 9th century. The copies were then copied into various manuscripts, and finally we have a copy today that was found in Cyprus around 1600 AD. Plutarch and Suetonius were copied in the 8th and 10th 11th centuries. The main copies that are used today come from the 14 to 1500s. I suspect but didn't confirm that the earlier copies have all been lost. Compared to Jesus. The Apostle Paul declared that Christianity is all in vain if Jesus was not resurrected. The evidence for the resurrection is all based on testimony. Early testimony from multiple sources is most significant. The Christian testimony of the resurrection comes from very early sources. When compared to other ancient events, it is dramatically closer to the actual event. If we are to accept an early account, then we need to be able to trust that we really have the early account. The New Testament manuscripts are almost an order of magnitude closer to when the reports were written than for most events from that period. All this is to say that the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus Christ by normal standards of history should automatically be declared valid. It was not a normal event though. Some will not accept the resurrection regardless of what type of evidence is given. No evidence can be sufficient for them. It is fair that the testimony should be scrutinized but not ruled out a priori. Why do you believe or don't you believe? McGregor, Kirkar. 1 Corinthians 15:3b6a, 7 in the bodily resurrection of Jesus in Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, 49 halves, June 2006, 225-34, https://www.etsjets.org/files/jets_49/49-2/jets_49-2_225-234_McGregor.pdf Another good reference. Cold Case Christianity. https://coldcaseofchristianity.com/writing/how early are the biblical accounts of Jesus/